In this video I plan to talk to you about the result generic type and how it falls short at the most sensitive moment. I will first apply the result type and then show you the problems it doesn't address well. Observe this domain model which models a book. It contains no validation, yet every book instance will be valid. There are two static factory methods, both referring to private constructors. EF-core uses the second private constructor. Therefore, we are only focused on the first private constructor, which is responsible for creating new book instances. It receives other domain objects. Assuming these objects are already valid, there is nothing to validate here. Take this book title object as an example. What is it? It is wrapping a string value which represents the raw title as well as the culture info that specifies the language of that string. The culture info is already a complex object and we assume it is correct since we have it. But the constructor must validate the string. It would throw on an invalid string. Therefore, there will never exist a book title object with a null or whitespace string in it. However, it is still throwing an exception. I see that as a violation of the design principle I follow. Exceptions are exceptional. We don't handle them. We may retry or quit the operation, but not really handle the exception. Watch my other video for a more detailed explanation of the distinction between errors and exceptions. That brings us to the place where I am catching that exception from the book titles constructor. This is the endpoint in the minimal API application. This endpoint handles an HTTP POST request to create a new book entity in the database. All this code you see is request validation. It ends some 75 lines of code later. We tend to collect as many validation errors as possible before responding with HTTP bad request response. Otherwise, the handler creates the domain objects one after another. In this try-catch block, I'm creating the title object. If all goes well, there will be the book entity at the end. I would add it to the database context and save the changes. After that, the endpoint returns the HTTP status 201, created, putting the newly created entity into the response body. The problem I see in this code is that it took 75 lines of code to prepare for only a dozen lines containing useful work. The principal reason for that code bloat lies in how I'm raising errors from inside the domain models. This block handles that exception thrown by the book title. All I can do in case of the exception is add the invalid title message to the collection of field validation errors. That is where the result generic type comes to relieve us from this bloat. I will now apply the result type by the book. That will quickly uncover its limitations, which I will address afterward. The result type is just a class that may contain a value of generic type T or an error of generic type T error. Unlike in functional programming, the object-oriented result type typically exposes a Boolean property indicating whether it represents a result of a successful operation or a failure. And so I might declare both the success result and the error object as nullable. Precisely one of these would be null at any given time. You don't let anyone initialize these values arbitrarily and therefore the constructor is private. The callers would need to use one of the two static factory methods to initialize the result object, either by telling it is a success and passing a non-null value to it, or by telling that it was a failure and passing the error object. Either way, the factory method would set the isSuccess flag appropriately. There are a few problems with this design. One is that every consumer of the result object would need to query the isSuccess Boolean flag, typically inside an if instruction. The second issue is that the nullable value will generate warnings on the calling end. The same will happen if we attempt to use the error object. It is also nullable even though we do not plan to access it before consulting the isSuccess property. I will avoid that nuisance with a slight modification. The nullable objects would be private fields. Both public properties would return non-nullable objects. However, property getters would fail with invalid operation exception if someone tries to use them in an inappropriate state, as determined by isSuccess. There will be no warnings in the calling code, but you must pay attention before accessing any of these properties. Still, the principal issue of branching around isSuccess remains. Let's see how that affects the book title model. We would typically hide a constructor in order to expose a so-called smart constructor instead. A smart constructor is just a static factory method which, unlike the class constructor, has a return value. It is usual to return an option from the smart constructor, but just in this demo, I will return a result with a string error. The smart constructor would validate the arguments, possibly returning a failure. Only after passing validation would it return the success result with the new book title instance. This design is preferable to throwing from inside the constructor, especially if you are accustomed to chaining the mapping operations on the result type. That is the advanced technique which I will not cover in this video, unfortunately. Before I show you how this new design affects the endpoint, let me remind you that you can download this entire source code before and after the redesign from my Patreon page. Patrons are the reason why this channel is free. By becoming a patron, you help hundreds of other fellow programmers watch more than 100 videos on my channel for free. I will now improve the endpoint while still staying firmly within the premises of object-oriented programming. That won't make me happy in the end, but let's put things in motion anyway. Instead of using the constructor and then catching the exception, we get one call and a descriptive type that warns us that it might not contain the result. This is the lesson in declarative programming too. Use types to declare your intentions. That helps reduce confusion and bugs. There is a warning on the title culture because I'm still constructing it in the old way. I want to turn this into a result as well. Since the culture info is the framework class, I will integrate it with the result type via an extension method. There will be a custom extension method that will turn a string into a result of culture info. It would catch that same culture not found exception and convert it into a failure. If no exception is thrown, the resulting culture info object will end up inside the success result. And so we can return to where we constructed the title's culture. And there you have it, another one-liner. This is the principal benefit of using the result type. Look how short and expressive my code is becoming. By setting the result, which is either a culture info or a string, I'm telling myself as clearly as it gets that I might or might not have the culture info object in my hands. For example, reading the value from the title culture would be insane here. The result type should be enough to warn me that the value might not exist. We shall return to this issue. There is another culture info object I used here. It will be another result of culture info from now on. I believe you have already got a point of how this works. I have applied the result type to all other components of the domain model here. That led to the deletion of some 40 lines of code in the process, and all the objects are self-evident now. Each of these small objects might or might not exist depending on the validity of the input record received from the web request. Still, there are a couple of issues here. First of all, I'm not reporting any field errors anymore. The result type alone will not do that for us. While I have deleted a lot of previous code, I need to add some of it back now. I must check if the result is a failure and translate it into the field validation error, which I am meticulously populating for the HTTP response. I did it for the publisher object. I will do the same with a few other results that follow. But after this line, the situation changes. I'm using the title culture in the next operation, but I cannot tell whether that value exists. This call might throw. That is probably the most difficult part of validation. The validation is usually a cascading process. You finish one stage, but then check whether everything went well before commencing the next stage. I will return early in case there are errors. Only after this will I be safe to access the values inside the result objects I possess. The coding pattern repeats itself by checking the result and adding the field validation error after each step. In the end, you will have your valid objects. This endpoint handles a large HTTP request, and so it contains a lot of validation. It is a good example of what the result type can and cannot do. The good thing is that you can safely access the values of all results once you ensure there are no failures among them. Another great thing is that all these objects are self-evident. You don't need documentation to explain them. Their type tells what they mean and even how you should use them. You should learn to enjoy the look of declarative types. And there are as many downsides as the upsides. The first one is that consuming the result type is always procedural. The result type with a Boolean property is not object-oriented. The next downside follows naturally. The result type doesn't help with fluent validation. That also means you cannot design the happy path separately from error handling. That is a massive defeat of the idea. How will you address those shortcomings? One possibility lies in turning the result type into its functional counterpart, also known as the result type, only the functional one this time. But that is the theme for another video.